The wind howled across the cliffs of Cornwall that night, carrying with it the distant roar of the sea. Inside the Carter home, the glow of a single lamp illuminated the hallway. Elizabeth Carter tucked her daughter, little Amelia, into bed, smoothing the child's dark curls and pressing a gentle kiss upon her forehead. Amelia clutched her beloved teddy bear, whispering that she wanted to hear the lullaby once more. Elizabeth lingered by the doorway, humming softly until her daughter's eyes fluttered closed. The scent of the sea mixed with a faint trace of lavender drifting from the candle on the dresser. It seemed like an ordinary evening, peaceful, almost too quiet. Moments later, the silence shattered. A faint crackle reached Elizabeth's ears. She turned her head and froze. Smoke curled under Amelia's door, thin at first, then thickening rapidly. Panic clawed at her chest. She rushed inside, finding her daughter still, her small body unmoving amidst the smoke that spread like a dark veil. Elizabeth grabbed Amelia in her arms, coughing violently as heat pressed against her skin. Flames licked at the curtains, swallowing them whole. The teddy bear dropped to the floor, already smoldering. She screamed her husband's name, Michael, but the house answered only with the roar of fire. Her calls went unanswered. The air grew impossible to breathe. Stumbling, blinded by smoke, Elizabeth forced her way through the hallway, her daughter limp in her grasp. She stumbled onto the lawn outside just as neighbors rushed forward, their shouts piercing the chaos. But Amelia did not stir. The child's eyes remained closed, her lips pale. And Michael, he was nowhere to be seen. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she held onto her daughter, fear and despair battling within her. She could not yet know that the fire would uncover not only tragedy, but also a betrayal that would shatter her world beyond repair. The following morning, a heavy mist lingered over the village. The ruins of the Carter home still smoldered, blackened beams jutting against the grey sky like broken bones. Elizabeth sat on the steps of the neighbor's porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes hollow from sleepless grief. Amelia was gone, and the world had fallen silent without her laughter. When Michael finally appeared, his hair disheveled and his shirt creased, Elizabeth's heart clenched. She expected him to fall to his knees, to hold her, to weep for their child. Instead, his face hardened, and his eyes narrowed with a coldness she had never seen before. "This is your fault," he spat, his voice sharp as a blade. "You should have been watching her. How could you let this happen?" The words struck Elizabeth harder than the fire ever could. She stared at him, bewildered, unable to speak. The neighbors looked on, whispers rippling through the gathering crowd. Grief twisted into confusion. How could he stand there, blaming her, when she had risked everything to save their daughter? The police inspector cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We believe the fire started in Amelia's room. Possibly a candle knocked over by accident." Elizabeth opened her mouth to protest, to explain that Amelia could not have reached the candle. But Michael cut across her with venom. "Do you hear that? Negligence. Your negligence." Her chest tightened as the words echoed, each syllable branding her like fire. The neighbors turned their eyes away, some shaking their heads, as though her guilt were already written in the ashes of her home. Elizabeth's gaze drifted to Michael's hands. There, glinting in the pale morning light, was the silver lighter she had never seen before. Something in her stomach sank. A chill crept down her spine. And in that moment, she knew, her husband was hiding something. That evening, after the officers left and the murmurs of neighbors faded, Elizabeth found herself wandering through the wreckage of her home. The walls were charred, the air still heavy with smoke. Each step crunched against blackened wood and broken glass. Her heart ached as she passed Amelia's room. The cot stood twisted, the paint blistered, and the scent of burnt fabric lingered. On the scorched floor, half buried in ash, something caught her eye. Elizabeth knelt and picked it up. It was the very same silver lighter she had glimpsed earlier in Michael's hand. Her breath caught. The metal was warm, almost alive, as though it still remembered the flames it had birthed. She turned it over in her palm, tracing the engraved initials, M.C. Her husband's. A wave of dread swept over her. Could Michael have started the fire? Why would he even possess such a thing? He had always claimed he did not smoke. Questions swarmed her mind, their weight crushing. Later, when Michael returned, he seemed unusually calm. His eyes darted away from hers, his excuses rehearsed. "I was out on business," he muttered, avoiding her stare. "I came back as soon as I heard." Elizabeth tightened her grip on the lighter, hiding it in the pocket of her coat. She said nothing, but inside her fury burned hotter than the fire that had taken Amelia. That night, as she lay awake in the neighbor's spare room, Elizabeth thought of her daughter's final breath, of Michael's cold accusation, and of the lighter now resting beside her pillow. And a single, terrifying thought haunted her: Amelia's death was no accident. 2 days later, Elizabeth stood before the charred remains of her home once more. Investigators had left, taking with them photographs, samples, and questions that echoed in her mind. Yet there were truths they had not uncovered, truths Elizabeth could sense but not yet prove. She clutched the silver lighter in her pocket as she walked through the narrow lanes of the village. The whispers of neighbors followed her, their eyes sharp with suspicion. To them, she was already guilty. That afternoon, while arranging temporary lodging at a small inn, Elizabeth overheard 2 women speaking near the window. Their voices were low, but the name they mentioned cut through the air like a knife. Michael Carter, one of them said, was seen in Truro the night of the fire. Not alone, mind you. With Evelyn Whitmore. Elizabeth froze. Evelyn Whitmore. A name she knew too well. The daughter of a wealthy landowner, known for her charm and reputation as a woman who could bend men to her will. Evelyn had been Michael's acquaintance from years past. Or so he had claimed. Her blood turned cold. While Amelia's room was filling with smoke, while Elizabeth risked her life to pull her daughter from the fire, her husband had been in another town, laughing, drinking, perhaps even touching another woman. That night, Elizabeth confronted him. Michael stood by the window of their temporary lodgings, the lamplight outlining the sharpness of his jaw. She asked him directly where he had been. He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't have to explain myself to you. Perhaps if you had been a better mother, Amelia would still be alive." Elizabeth's heart thundered. Her fingers brushed against the lighter hidden in her sleeve. She did not reply, for the truth was already unraveling before her eyes. Her husband was not only a liar. He was a man living a double life. The inn where Elizabeth now stayed had no comfort for her grief. Nights were long, filled with echoes of Amelia's laughter that no longer existed. Yet Elizabeth's sorrow slowly sharpened into resolve. She needed answers, and the lighter in her possession was only the beginning. One evening, Inspector Harris called her to the station. His tone was careful, but his words unsettled her. "We recovered fragments of Amelia's toys and a half-burnt teddy bear. But there is something else. Security footage from a nearby shop shows Michael leaving the village shortly before the fire began." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She sat rigid as the inspector slid a photograph across the desk. In the blurred image, Michael could be seen climbing into his car, and beside him, clear enough to wound, was Evelyn Whitmore. Her fingers trembled as she held the photograph. So, while my daughter was trapped inside, he was, with her. The inspector shifted uneasily. "We cannot draw conclusions yet. But it raises questions." That night, Elizabeth returned to the inn, her mind ablaze with fury. Michael had lied about everything. He had left Amelia drugged in her bed, a candle burning close, and fled with his mistress. Elizabeth remembered the untouched glass of milk on Amelia's bedside table, the faint smell of something bitter when she had entered the room that night. Her stomach twisted with horror. Sleeping pills. He had given their daughter sleeping pills to ensure she would not wake. Elizabeth clutched the photograph to her chest, tears blurring her vision. Amelia had not stood a chance. And Michael, he had planned it. Days bled into nights, each one heavier than the last. Elizabeth carried the weight of Amelia's absence like a stone bound to her chest. She expected grief to be shared, but Michael showed no sorrow. Instead, he arrived one morning with a folder of papers under his arm. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. "I want a divorce," he said flatly, tossing the documents onto the table at the inn. "There's nothing left between us." Elizabeth's breath caught. She stared at the papers, her mind struggling to grasp the cruelty. Their daughter had just been buried, and now he wanted to sever the last thread that bound them. "You blame me for Amelia," Michael continued, his tone sharp. "And the truth is, I don't care to live with a woman who ruins everything she touches." Her fingers brushed over the documents, the ink still fresh. Beneath the sting of his words, something stirred inside her, a quiet, determined strength. He thought he could discard her, sweep her aside like ashes. But he did not know what she held in her possession: the lighter, the photograph, and the truth. Elizabeth lifted her gaze, her voice steady though her heart trembled. "I'll sign them." Michael smirked, surprised by her compliance. "Good. The sooner this ends, the better." But as he turned away, Elizabeth's eyes hardened. He thought he had won, that his lies would bury her as thoroughly as the fire had buried Amelia. Yet Elizabeth was no longer the grieving wife he believed her to be. She was preparing for a battle that would expose everything he had done. And for the first time since the fire, she felt a spark of control. The autumn winds swept through the streets of Cornwall, rattling the shutters of the inn where Elizabeth stayed. Each night she planned quietly, gathering every piece of evidence she had. The lighter. The photo of Michael with Evelyn on the night of the fire. The whispers from neighbors who had seen him slip away before the blaze. She knew she could not confront him directly, not yet. Michael was powerful in charm, and his lies were slick enough to turn suspicion away from himself. Elizabeth needed something stronger, something undeniable. An opportunity came sooner than she expected. Evelyn, flushed with wine, appeared in the village market, her voice loose and careless. Elizabeth watched from the shadows as Evelyn bragged to a friend. "He promised me everything once she's out of the way. That fire, it should have solved everything." Elizabeth's heart raced. The words hung in the cold air like smoke. She stepped closer, unnoticed, until every syllable carved itself into her memory. It was not yet proof, but it was the thread she needed to unravel the whole tapestry. That night, Elizabeth wrote a letter, anonymous, careful, and sent it to a local solicitor known for his discretion. She enclosed the photograph and the lighter, urging him to hold them in confidence until she came with more. Michael thought the divorce would silence her. Evelyn thought the affair was hidden in shadows. But Elizabeth was laying a snare, one that would tighten with every lie they spoke. And as the candle burned low in her room, Elizabeth whispered into the darkness, "For Amelia." The courthouse in Truro loomed grey against the morning mist, its stone walls cold as judgment itself. Elizabeth stood at the steps, her shawl pulled tight, the weight of Amelia's memory steadying her trembling hands. She had waited for this moment, and now the snare was ready to snap shut. Inside, Michael sat with Evelyn at his side, their confidence dripping like venom. He looked across the chamber at Elizabeth with a smirk, certain she had no fight left in her. The magistrate called the room to order, and Elizabeth rose. Her voice was calm, measured, as she laid the evidence before the court. The lighter found at the scene. The photograph proving Michael's absence during the fire. And then, the testimony of a neighbor who had heard Evelyn's drunken confession in the market. Piece by piece, the mask slipped from Michael's face. "You lied," Elizabeth said, her words cutting through the silence. "You left our daughter alone. You condemned her to the flames." Michael's composure cracked. His eyes darted, seeking escape, but there was none. Evelyn shifted nervously, her earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of exposure. The chamber stirred with murmurs, the truth heavy in the air. The magistrate leaned forward, his tone severe. These are grave accusations, supported by evidence and testimony. Mr. Carter, you will be held to account. Michael's smirk vanished, replaced by the pale mask of a man cornered. Elizabeth felt no triumph, only a deep, steady sorrow. Yet beneath it was something sharper, justice. Amelia's voice would never return, but her truth had been spoken at last. As the gavel struck, echoing like thunder through the chamber, Elizabeth closed her eyes. The reckoning had come.